All right, I think we'll get started here. All right, good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started. A few minutes past the bottom of the hour. Can you hear me? It used to get like one. Let's bring up the mic a little bit.
For your pass, brother.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, I'll bring the mic up a little closer. How's that? Is that a little bit better? I think we'll get started here this morning. Glad to. What's that? We're busy talking. Well, that's right. That's right. I appreciate everybody coming here today. As I was looking for some interesting facts or something to start off with, I saw that this is the first week for Marysville City Schools. So I guess to all my friends, this is the most wonderful time of the year, unless you're a teacher, I guess. But looking forward to that. It means fall is coming. As you can see on the slide, today we're going to be talking about friendship. And as iron sharpens iron, so does one sharpen another. And the guide verse can be found Proverbs 27:17. And before we begin, I just kind of want to share a little bit of context. Something that I thought was a little interesting is back in May when Jason was asking for teachers, David Finn originally signed up to teach this class, but he forgot that this is their 5-year anniversary. So he and Allie are out of town today, and I stepped in to help him. So we practice what we preach. So David was supposed to sign up. He wasn't able to, so I jumped in to help him. Also, as you know, anytime I speak, it usually takes me multiple days to put a lesson together, refine my thoughts, put it together into flow. And this week was just one of those weeks where I just couldn't get to it. And so most of this was prepared yesterday. So the takeaway is that, please speak up. If there's a thought here that's not quite developed and you have something you want to share, please, by all means. I want this to be collaborative. Again, as the lesson is, we are all here to sharpen one another. So please feel free to speak up, and hopefully this will be a conversation rather than a lecture. So before we begin, I'd like to open with prayer. So if you wouldn't mind, just bow your heads here, and we'll go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for sending your Son to be an example and your Spirit to be a companion. Lord, help us to support one another in the same way so that we can all grow closer to you. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. So as I said, the guide verse today is, as iron sharpens iron, so does one person sharpen another. And this verse is usually mentioned in the context of friendship. But before we talk about friendship, I'd like to talk about some ways that this verse applies to all of us, regardless if they're our friends. And before we begin, too, I just wanted to give you a little idea of the structure of the slides. So anytime I present a point, I try to put a Bible verse down at the bottom to support that point. And so I'd like for you to read those Bible verses and then tell me what you think about it. Would you have picked another verse? How do you think it applies to this? And use that for the topic of the discussion. So the first thing is we are all to set an example. This is one of those edits that I did this morning. I had originally said we are all to set an example. And the more I got to thinking about that, whenever somebody says you need to set an example, what's in my mind is that I put on an act, if you will, or put on a facade. Like, I need to be on my best behavior so that other people can see the correct behavior. And the more I got to think about that, that's not what this intent is. We aren't to act so that we can set an example. We are to be an example. For example, is the language that you use in the church or the language that you don't use in the church the same as out there? Are you more generous to folks in here than you are to folks out there? Are you kinder and more gracious to everyone here than folks out there? There shouldn't be any difference in behavior. We are to be an example so that we can set it for others and show them how to reflect, or I guess a better way says we're to reflect Jesus so that others can see Jesus through us. So I did change that. I edited it. I don't think that we should set the example per se. We should be the example so that we can be a model for others. You know, we hold people in high esteem, you know, people with position in high esteem. One example I have is, many of you remember Joel Cottrell. He is a Nashville police officer. Well, you know, several years ago, we were out in the back roads in my Corvette, and we were enjoying the car, let's just say. And I looked over and I said, how fast you going over there, Officer Cottrell? And he got a big grin on his face and backed it down. But, you know, we always hold people in authority to a higher standard. And I think there's application here as well. What comments do you have about this?
I just think, man, about how Jesus said to his disciples, somebody said to him, you know, show us the Father, it's going to be enough. He said, you know, have I been with you so long? He goes, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, you know. And so Jesus' own example, you know, showing us, you know, how God would interact with people. He was never too busy. He was never too holy not to touch the leper, not to heal the poor and the sick. And I think the disciples probably learned as much, maybe more, by watching Jesus, his example, than the actual words that came out of his mouth.
Yes. I think no one spots a hypocrite faster than a kid, in my opinion. You know, if your actions aren't consistent with your words, folks are going to pick that up and they're going to see it, and they're going to discredit everything you say. You can say whatever you want, but if your actions don't follow it up, if you're saying you need to have these virtues in church, and then when you go out to Lowe's, you're being rude to the staff there, no one's going to listen to what you say here in this building. I think there was a hand. Absolutely. Yeah, if you don't humble yourself, God will, and he has a good sense of humor. The next thing this all applies to us is, we are all obligated to teach and correct. Now, I don't know where Patty is. I'm sure she's like, amen, yes, yes. That's not what I mean, per se. Not everyone is called to be a literal teacher, stand in front of a group to teach. That may not be your calling. But all of us are required to when we set an example, we are required to teach and correct anyone, not just kids, anyone around us. And, with kids, it could be both behavioral or theological. And I'm not saying we go around and punish, other people's kids, even though some of us probably would like to. But, when there's, behaviors, kids not sharing, having a bad attitude, we're all obligated to pull them aside and show them how to correctly handle those type of situations. Obviously, theological errors need to be corrected. There's no question about that. I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. But, there's been times after a lesson, some of you have come up to me and said, hey, I don't really agree with what you said, or I interpret it differently. And those type of discussions are great. And that's how, another way, we all help one another sharpen our skills. I think I saw a hand. Yeah. I always got corrected twice. Some, aunt, uncle, neighbor corrected me, and then when I got home, I got corrected again, usually stronger. I'm not saying not in a bad way. I mean, you get my point. Another one is that no one is too young. So everyone is in this together. No one is too young. And there's two sides of this that I want to talk about. Is the first side is to the folks who think that they're too young. Maybe it's because of your age, or maybe it's because you're a younger Christian and you don't think God can use any of your experiences. If that's you, please take note of this verse. I mean, God can use anyone, and that's that's cliche, but He really can. If you're a young Christian, you have got experiences that many of us don't have. And God can use that experiences to get with folks and get into groups that we just can't get into. God can use anyone in any circumstance, in any age, to correct everyone. And God does use those people. Which is the other side I want to talk about, is everyone else. The Bible verse here says, let no one despise you. So that no one, that's who I'm talking about right here. The people that don't want to take correction from somebody because they think they're too young or because they don't have the experience. In my experience, God rarely yells. He usually comes to us through the meek. So if somebody is younger, comes up to me and has some feedback, I'm going to listen to them very carefully, because that's something that I think needs to be evaluated. Because again, in my experience, God has rarely yelled at me. He's usually corrected me either through somebody younger or somebody that has, I don't want to say less experience or less, not as, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, as deep of a relationship with God. But in those circumstances, they're asking simple questions, and it's like, yeah, I don't know. Let's learn together. But anyway, as I said, no one is too young. God can use everyone. Does anyone have an example that they'd like to share about somebody younger has sharpened you? Yeah, Tim.
Share about my son-in-laws. Reba and I have 3 daughters, and 2 of my son-in-laws have taught me a lot about taking care of their wives, and just really, like Jesus said, that He was giving His life, for His bride, which is the church. I've seen that in AJ and Philip, and they just really honor my daughters, and I have been amazed. I mean, as the father-in-law, it's humbling to see that and to admit that, but I've not always done a very good job at that, and I have been taught by them quite a bit. It's just been their example, nothing they've said.
Yeah. I have one that was in another church. There was a kid, I guess, in his 20s, special needs, but he was still functional. We were at a project, we were working on a project, said, I can't teach, I can't do a lot of things, but I can help. And I thought that was pretty cool that he knew his limitations, but he also knew what he could do and help. And that really struck me. And if he can serve, then so can I. Yeah. Yeah, and God was preparing him for later. Obviously, we can see that now. Hindsight's made that clear. But if somebody had discouraged him back then and he quit, I mean, look what wouldn't have happened had that happened. Yeah. And the last one is, we're all stronger together. The world is going to challenge us, and if I'm in error, I would rather have you all correct me than have somebody out there point it out. Or if I'm being blinded by sin and I've got a blind spot, I'd rather have you all tell me to correct myself, then have its harmful effects impact me out there. So again, this is in the same vein, we're all together, we're all to help one another out. Again, the verse, as iron sharpens iron, we're all in this together to sharpen one another. Any other comments? Because before I switch gears, I want to talk a little bit more about friendship. All right, switching gears here a little bit to friendship. I want to first kind of start off with a vocabulary lesson, because I have learned over the years that the word friend means different things to different people. If you're an extrovert, you tend to hand that label out to anybody that you meet. If you're an introvert, you tend to save that title for some of your closest relationships. And then also, like many of you had to learn the hard way, not everyone is your friend. And sometimes that's okay. You know, there's coworkers who I'm friendly with and I want to help them out, and we have no ill will towards one another, but there's no expectation that they would ever show up if I ever was having a bad day. So, while we're friendly, they're not really labeled as a friend in my mind. Did anybody watch the sitcom The Big Bang Theory? Yeah, I love that show. There was one episode where, if you're not sure of the premise of the show, it's 4 or 5 socially awkward nerds, if you will. And in one of the episodes, they came up with the friendship algorithm, because they were trying to figure out how to make friends. And so I just love this. It's partly because I'm in IT and I can really make sense of this, but it starts off with placing a call. Are they home? If not, you leave a message, wait for a call back, and when they call you back, you come up here, which is where you would go if they said yes. Ask them if they want to share a meal. If they say yes, you dine together and begin friendship. If they say no, you ask for a hot beverage. If they say yes, here's your options, begin friendship. If they say no, you ask, hey, would you like to do something? Find if they share an interest, and you keep going through that until you find one that's the least objectionable activity, and then you partake in the interest. If only friendship was that easy, right? But you know what? In a lot of ways, that's true. So what makes a friend a friend? In other words, how do you decipher a true friend from a Facebook friend, if you will? What are some criteria? I have some options, or I have some thoughts, but I want to hear what you have to say first. Time. How so? Agreed. Yes, time. What else? Longevity, yeah. Made it easy. Yeah, so longevity and experiences with one another, absolutely, absolutely. What else? What are some other signs? I'm sorry? Commonality? Like personality traits, or like situational, like,
Like people at work might be they might be friends at that level, but it's not like friends that are, no, like you say, that are no.
Yeah, agreed. Just speaking for myself, I'm friends with people at work because we have similar interests. We think similar. We're working at the same company, so we have similar goals, similar interests. So it just naturally we've become friends. And then I've got other friends that just completely different than me, and that's fine. It's just, as you said, commonality is. It's easier to make friends when you have similar interests, and develop the friendship. Yeah, Tim.
I had asked Mary Ellen, and she told me the Good Samaritan. I was trying to remember that story because they didn't have the longevity or even commonality. You know, here's two people that became, I'm sure, very good friends, and we don't know the end of the story, but, you know, the Good Samaritan reached out to this guy and met his needs and sacrificed for him in a way that all his other supposed friends did not or would not. And so I would just say by the amount, how invested are you?
Yeah. Friend's going to sacrifice.
Kind of like Tim and I were talking earlier before we came to class, and we've got a ton of dispute, but we have different views on certain. But both of us respect each other. He's not going to be my enemy because he has a different thought than I do. So I've been friends with Democrats.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
so separated now. It's, you know, it's bad. But Tim and I have a thought that we look at it different. But it's not going to cause either one of us to hit it over the head or go away from each other.
Learning to disagree is a lost art or a dying art. Yeah. So here's my thoughts. And a lot of you have said the same thing. One sign of a friend is they show up. And they just don't show up to parties, but they stay to clean. You know, they show up to cut your grass or deliver food or offer company if you're infirmed. And also the language changes too. You know, a casual friend or an acquaintance will say, well, you know, call me if you need anything, or let me know if you need help, or something like that. Whereas a true friend will say, well, what can I do? How can I help? Where can I serve? So the language changes a little bit differently, but they show up. And that's one thing I've learned in life is, you know, if you don't know what to say, just show up. That's 90%. Just be there for your friends. Another attribute is that they don't keep score. You know, as the Bible verse says there, you know, sinners interact with people expecting to be paid in return. And they do things for others expecting to be paid in return. Maybe not immediately, but down the road. You know, you might help somebody out when they're financially struggling, you know, with the expectation that if you're struggling, they will do the same thing. That's not so true with friends. Friends will sacrifice regardless of whether or not you can pay them back, and they're happy to do so. Another attribute is they compassionately, and I underline that, tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. Sometimes you need to hear a hard truth. Sometimes you need a word of encouragement. And if you do need to hear a hard truth, you know, I know people that like to say, well, I speak my mind, or I just tell it like it is. Well, okay, but, you know, when you're a friend, you can compassionately share that message and not hurt the friendship, but still get the point across. And I think it takes a whole lot more maturity to hold your tongue than speak your mind, but that's another topic for another day. But I think friends are able to, they tell you exactly what you need to hear to be stronger, and just don't give you empty platitudes. And then the fourth one that I'd like to talk about is they just make life better. You know, like any relationship, it takes effort, it takes time, it takes longevity to build trust. But if they're a true friend, they make your life better. If they're bringing in drama, they're bringing in problems, they always need something from you, but they always need something from you, but they never return that favor. Victim mentality, all of those are attributes of people that aren't your friend. They're just folks that are using you. What do you agree with this list? What would you add to it? Or what would you disagree with?
I'm just thinking James 5:16, I would say that a true friend is somebody that you can confess your sins to and pray for one another, get healed.
Yeah. I'll talk about that in a second, but you're absolutely right. A friend you can...
Which requires vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we have lots and lots of acquaintances, as you said, people at work and all that kind of thing, but how many people really are in your life that you're going to talk straight to them and tell them, this is what I'm struggling with, this is what I need prayers for, and know that they're going to come along beside you, encourage you, and pray for you.
Mm-hmm. Great transition. What are some roadblocks to friend? That's one of them is pride. I think it's pride. I have it labeled here. It's further down on my list, but pride, like you said, I don't say especially for men because I can only speak from that point of view, but guys don't like to admit vulnerabilities to anybody, let alone other men. Things where we struggle, that's just not something that comes natural. And so when you don't share those things and don't open up, that is a roadblock to friends. It's hard to be a friend if you got a wall up. Absolutely. What are some other roadblocks to friendships?
Like your bench picture up here. Why aren't they talking?
Yeah, agreed.
You gotta open up. It's like when I get on an elevator, everybody's close in, and what, 9 times out of 10, you keep your mouth shut, because that's somebody different, as far as you know they're different. I always tell them that I'll pay for the ride. And it opens up a conversation.
If you're getting
I talk.
Yeah.
Everybody knows I talk, so.
turn around and smile at everybody, that make them uncomfortable. Yeah, you mentioned why are these people sitting on the bench? Obviously I have no idea, I didn't take the picture, but I think one of the roadblocks to a friendship and maybe one of the reasons why those girls were sitting separate on the bench is our phones, I think, are a big roadblock to friendship. And they're two double-edged sword. Phones enable us to stay connected. And when I'm talking about a smartphone, obviously, the phones from back in the day are different. But, I think we're all old enough, or most of us are old enough to remember a day before we had these. And it was some ways more difficult to keep in contact with my friends, but also a lot easier because now I had to actually pick up a phone and have a real conversation or write a letter or go over to visit with them. And as you can see in the picture, how many times are you at a restaurant and you see the whole family with their head in their phones? I'm guilty of it too. I try my best not to look at a phone when I'm with somebody for lunch. Either leave it in the car so I'm not tempted to, or just leave it in my pocket. Another thing I've learned is I use app timers all the time on my phone. It has it. I limit the social media apps just to prevent myself from being on the phone too much. I heard once, I haven't been able to corroborate this, but I have no reason to doubt that it's not true, or at least directionally correct, that a stat that said that on average, or the average person will scroll through 300 feet of social media. So, on your phone, if you scroll up, that's 8 inches, 4 inches, or whatever. As you keep scrolling, the addition of all of that is about 300 feet in a day. And that's the average person. So I've seen some people that are on their phone way more than average. But any comments on that? How your phones can be a roadblock to friendship?
Probably everyone has seen the information about nursing school and the state is requiring limits. And there's a couple books on it, and it really has changed. But it has changed the brain.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good topic right there, talking about social media. Another roadblock to friendship is dishonesty and gossip. Now, the verse I chose here says, if anybody's caught in sin, and you can read the verse there. So, that's mostly how it's applicable to us. If we see somebody who's either in sin, or maybe it's not necessarily a sin, but doing something we just don't agree with, or maybe, Roger, as you said, maybe it's somebody has a different political view or whatever, rather than addressing that with the individual, it's tempting to gossip and talk about them behind their back. And of course, anytime that happens, that's not a friendship, and that will put up a roadblock to building relationships with other folks. Another roadblock is our busyness. And the verse I chose really isn't applicable here, but I wanted to put it up here because it's a habit when we get busy to put church, put friendships, put everything like that on the side. I think we assume that our friends will always be there, church will always be there, and so let's just take care of this soccer season, let's go take care of this work project, and then I'll come back to it. but that can be a slippery slope. I think one of Satan's more effective methods to keep us neutral or lukewarm is to fill our schedule with good things. You know, there's nothing wrong about having our children in soccer, but if the games are always on Sunday, then maybe that's a problem. And I'm not saying there's times when you're going to have to do that, but if you're being pulled away every Sunday, where are your priorities? Like I said, I'm kind of a little hypocritical here, though my busyness this week prevented me from working on this lesson here, but that's kind of an example, is that Satan likes to fill our schedules to prevent us, or to make it easier for us to maybe not spend as much time in God's Word that we would have otherwise, or spend time with our friends as we otherwise would have as well. Any comments on that? Yeah, David and Allie, we go out every Friday night to eat. That's just what we do, and I enjoy that time as well. But you're right, scheduling it makes people a priority. A couple of months ago, I did a Bible class on godly priorities, and that was one of the things is scheduling time with God, but also scheduling time with your friends as well. Because if you wait, we all know this, if you wait, you're never going to have time. And then the last one is jealousy and pride. And this is kind of going along with the dishonesty, and I think, Tim, you had mentioned that as well, pride and jealousy. When you're close to somebody, you get a peek behind the curtain, if you will. I mean, have you ever had a friend that seems to just naturally, just the things that you struggle just seem to come natural for them, and it kind of gets a little resentful? Maybe your friends are more successful than you are. They don't seem to work as many hours, but just seem to always have enough money at the end of the month and can do other things where you're struggling. Again, builds resentment towards other folks as well. And as I said, pride, and again, speaking for myself, it's very difficult to admit when I'm struggling. It's very difficult to admit when I'm having a bad day. And I don't then tell my friends, and they just see me acting strange and being quiet. But I'm, working through a situation in my mind, and so I don't let them in. And so that just kind of builds roadblocks as well to friendship. Those are my 4. Do you have any others that you would add? Yeah, sorry.
I have noticed myself sometimes having the attitude of non-Christians different towards friendship than my friends in the church. And there's good parts of that, of course, and bad parts about it. And the bad part is, like, I don't want to let them, they know I'm a Christian, I want to be a good example, so I don't get real with them. But I had a particular example of a friend who, when I finally got really real with her, she just opened up. Now she felt comfortable with me telling her about her real life.
Nice.
How she is.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's cool. So that gave you an opportunity then to share because they opened up. That's cool. Thank you. Any other comments?
I just piggybacking on Mary Ellen's comment, I think openness begets openness, of course, and I can remember, for me, that was one of the things that enabled me to be real with the Christians that were reaching out to me, was that they didn't try to appear like they had it all together, but they were vulnerable. They were relatively new Christians themselves. I don't think any of them had been Christians for more than a year or a year and a half. But they said that is, when I told them, look, I don't know if I could do that, because I struggle with this. One of them was giving up my free time. I don't know if I can go to church Sunday morning Sunday night, Wednesday night, go to a Bible study in the middle of the week. You know, I don't know if I can do that. And they just said, we get it, you know, we're the same way, you know, but, you know, and then they would just share. And I think that, you know, if people, Christians especially, can let people in the world know that, hey, just because we're Christians, we know we're not perfect. We know we're not trying to lord it over anybody, you know. We've got sin, you know, we've got issues, but we also have a Savior. And a lot of times that's the missing link, you know. People will, you know, as Mary Ellen said.
I think we all struggle with the same things. You know, you might struggle with it a little different than me, but I think, you know, there's always something commonality. You get my point. Maybe not exactly you and I, but you get my point. That, you know, when we open up, we can find people that are struggling with the same things we are. And again, the iron sharpens iron. That'll really help when you can find those people. You know, compare notes. What did you do? How are you handling it? And vice versa. Share best practices and best way to help others. All right. I have some final thoughts here, and then we'll wrap up. So the first final thought I have is choose your friends wisely. It is true that iron will sharpen iron, but if it's done incorrectly, it will also dull iron. As I said, not everyone is your friend, and don't wait until you need one to find out who they are. So you want to look for godly friends, look at everyone that exhibits the attributes that we talked about a few slides ago, and look to make sure you know who your friends are and make sure that they are godly and can help you grow in your spiritual walk. The next one is, and this is probably the most important, I guess I'm burying my lead here, one thing you're not supposed to do when you give a presentation, but I think this one is probably the one thing that I would hope you take away of everything that I said. Cultivate your friendships. It's easy, especially as an adult, to get stuck in daily routine, stuck in your lives, and not cultivate your friends. And you say, well, you know, I've got my spouse, my wife or husband, I've got my spouse, you know, that's fine, you know, they can, you know, you guys are taking care of each other's needs, and that's great, and that's what is supposed to happen. But, you know, what if your spouse dies? My brother's going through that right now, and so where are his friends? You know, he's by himself, and now he's, you know, looking for support from his friends. Cultivate your friendships, and again, not only does it help you, but you can help them, and your life will be much better, much easier when you have friends, true friends that'll be around you. Pray for your friends. And I think this should go without saying, but sometimes it needs to be said. You know, when you share and you understand somebody struggling with them, pray for them. One of my biggest pet peeves is when Christians say, I'll pray for you, and then they don't. If I ever say I'm praying for you, you know that I'm going to pray for you. And if I don't say it, it's because, you know, I'm not going to make a promise, I guess is what I'm going to say, an empty promise. Pray for your friends, pray for them by name, and then check up with them and say, hey, I've been praying for you. Let them know that you are on their mind. And then the last thought I have is, oh, please, absolutely.
I know I'm making a lot of comments, but I feel really strongly about that one because I don't even think husbands and wives pray for each other like they should. I know when my mom died, I mean, it was hard for several reasons, but one of the most important reasons, because I knew that she prayed for me every day. And Reba asked me what I was struggling with, you know, and I just thought, you know, I don't know if I have a single person who's taken my name before God every day anymore since my mom passed away. And Reba was convicted about that. She goes, wow, you know, I haven't been, you know, and to be honest, I hadn't been taking her before God every day either. But that's crucial. You know, praying for each other, praying for people that we call friends.
Totally agree. And the last thought I have is, you know, this is the second most important thing we do. You know, the first is to love the Lord with all your heart. The second is love your neighbor as yourself. So cultivating friendships, being there for one another, helping them, praying for them, supporting them, that's what we're supposed to be doing. And so again, it is the second most important thing we do. What comments do you have? I'll say one last thing and then we'll close in prayer here, kind of piggybacking off I was debating on whether or not to say it. If you couldn't tell, I was quiet there. I was trying to decide. In my situation, being single, I don't have a spouse, so my friends are it. And as I get older, I see less and less of them because they get busy with families and lives and everything. And I get it, don't get me wrong. But I see that, I can see them. They're not spending time cultivating their friendships. They're not praying for their friendships. And I'm concerned that when they need friends, they're not going to be there. And as I said, I've been in situations, when early in my career, I moved around quite a bit and I struggled. I'm just a quiet guy. It takes me a long time to make friends. So when I moved around, before cell phones, I would have to almost start over again. So there were some times where I just didn't have any friends. I didn't have any support. And that's tough. That's tough dealing with life without having anybody to talk to. So every one of those I absolutely support. Cultivating your friends and praying for them. I can't tell you enough how important that is. Josh, I hate to put you on the spot. Would you mind closing in prayer? Thanks, Josh.